The Appalachian has some pretty freaky stuff happening in it. And that's why in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you some eyewitness accounts of strange, bizarre experiences happening all within the Appalachian Mountains area. In fact, this first story, sent to me by whom I will refer to as Roger, had a strange experience, and no, it wasn't with a monster, it was with a person that he can't quite explain. Let me give you the gist. Back in 2016, Roger had gone on a solo hiking trek for at least 3 or 4 days at a time. He was right around West Virginia, but did not exactly go into detail on the whereabouts of where in West Virginia. From the information he had relayed to me, he was somewhere along the confines of the Appalachian Trail, and said he had actually gone off the trail for at least 3 or 4 miles in the desolate West Virginia wilderness. Now here he had found a small clearing next to a small stream, perfect to set up camp and to establish himself for the time being. And that's exactly what he did. So the afternoon comes, it was pretty bright and sunny out, thankfully, since this was around summer spring. He gets his small one-person man tent set up, he gets his supplies out, has a piece of beef jerky, and he's feeling pretty good about himself. He's feeling like he is ready to tackle the world and go through this long 3-4 day hiking getaway because personal life has just become too stressful at this point in time. And after being there for a few hours, he goes over to the stream, fetches some water, and starts to fully establish his camp. Now, while he's there, it starts getting dark out. And so, after a while, he determines that it's time to go to bed. So he puts out his fire and ensures that his food is hung up in a tree as to not attract any nearby bears or anything. Climbs into his one-man tent, gets in his sleeping bag, and he is just about out for the night. Until he hears something that was probably roughly around 9 or 10 p.m. It had just got dark, and again, this was around spring, summer, so you have to account for daylight savings time, and Roger vividly recalls hearing a voice. Now, not just any voice, but a child's voice. If he had to put his finger on it, he described it as being somewhere around a 10 to 12-year-old boy. Now, instantly, he thought that there was a child that was lost in the wilderness. And so he pops up out of his sleeping bag, pops his head out of his tent, and he's looking around, and he could hear the child's voice off in the distance, and so he shines his flashlight and he's looking, but he can't see anything. Now, the child's voice didn't sound like this child was in distress. It sounded as if this child was having a conversation with someone or something, and the voice was loud enough that you could hear it was clearly a child, but low enough in volume you couldn't make out what was being said. And after maybe 30 seconds to a minute of this going on, he calls out, asking if this child needs help, going, "Hey! Hey, are you okay?" Nothing. Just continued conversation from this child's voice, who didn't sound that far away. And so, deciding that this kid might need help and that the situation is weird, he gets on his shoes, gets up, and starts walking off in the distance that he hears the voice. Now, at this point, he's probably no more than 100 yards total away from his tent and campsite as he's approaching and begins to hear the voice growing in volume, which means that he's closer to whoever this lost kid is. And as he gets closer, the voice suddenly stops. Complete silence. And he notices that even the crickets are completely quiet. Now, he's kind of confused because he's looking around with his flashlight, doesn't see anything. And remember, he's in a pretty large meadow, so there's really nothing to obstruct his vision of where this child should be. And now things are looking really strange because he just heard a kid's voice, he followed the voice, and even though he was calling for help the entire time, or asking the child if they needed help, there was no response. There was no inkling that the child even needed assistance or saving. And now that he followed the voice and got closer to the voice, it suddenly stopped. Maybe he's just having a hallucination, or maybe he's just been so exhausted from the past few days of hiking. He's like, you know what? I'm just going to go back to my tent and ignore it. And so he makes his way back to his tent, gets back in his sleeping bag, and just tries to close his eyes. Now, a couple minutes of him trying to wind his body down and kind of lull into a sleep, he starts to hear whispering on the back side of his tent. Now, not directly right up against his tent, but far enough away where it sounds like there's somebody there. And it sounds like that same kid's voice. But instead of it sounding like a casual conversation in tone and volume, it sounds like this kid, the same age, the same sex, everything, is now whispering really loudly. and is talking to someone. And he's now really acutely aware of this, and this voice is now sounding like it's getting closer to his tent. And so at this point, he's like, all right, this kid is playing games with me. So he gets up from his sleeping bag, crawls out of his tent, and shines the light quickly right over in that direction. But nothing. He could still hear the voice, but he could swear that the voice is so close, and the fact that he's in this open meadow, there's nowhere for this kid to possibly be hiding and not be seen. But he's hearing these very distinct whispers coming from a child that are no more than 20, 30 feet away from his camp. And he's looking around and he can't explain it. And now, at this point, Roger's beginning to feel very weirded out. As I mentioned previously, he's also very aware that all the sounds of the night have suddenly stopped. Now, when he went to bed, the forest was alive full of crickets and just the general night ambiance. But now everything was quiet except for this strange boy's whispers, which, again, looking around and can't see anything. So, after about 30 seconds, maybe a couple of moments of this, and getting frustrated and weirded out by all of this, he decides, you know what? I'm just going to go back to bed. I'm going to ignore it. If there is a kid out here who clearly needs help and is lost, he will yell for help, or at least hopefully come find my tent. So that's exactly what he does. He goes back, he lays down, and the whispering again gets louder and grows in intensity, getting almost right near his tent. But you know what? He chooses to ignore it and tries to fall into sleep. Now at some point, he does fall into a deep sleep and awakes with the sun shining in his face. So he pops up, gets out of his tent, it's morning time, he decides to pull some beef jerky and a protein bar out of his backpack, and as he's rifling through his stuff, and he's looking down, grabbing a protein bar, he notices tracks. And not just any tracks, but bare feet tracks, like the size of a child. And he notices they're going right around his camp, and they trail off into the woodline where he heard the voices from the previous night. And he's thinking, my God, there really is a kid out here. I hope he's okay. And so he's beginning to call out, hey, are you okay? Nothing. The forest is now alive with birds and the general sounds of the day, and no trace of this mystery child who had clearly come through his campsite in the middle of the night sometime. And so he decides to just brush it off the best he can, and just, you know what? As weird as this is, I don't have any explanation for it, so I'm just going to continue on and go hiking. So this day, he leaves his campsite, and he decides to go venture off and explore off the trail even further. Now, the day itself isn't that eventful because he goes about 5 or 6 miles and just explores the general area. Now, during the course of his adventuring, he told me that he had found some strange stuff that doesn't really make sense. So, for example, one of the first things he found, probably about no more than 4 miles away from his campsite, was a dead buck with its head completely twisted around. And he thought that was extremely strange because there are no large predators that kill that way. They don't do that to a deer. And in fact, its entire body seemed to be intact. It's almost as if this deer or buck had laid down on its side and died, but the entire head was twisted and mangled, as if it either got it caught in something or something actually twisted its head around and left it there. He kind of just got the heebie-jeebies from it and decided to leave it alone. Now, he continued his hike about another 1.5 miles to where he came to another small clearing where there's actually a bunch of trees, almost kind of like a thick grove, right near the clearing. And on one side, he could actually see that there were several young saplings that were twisted and intertwined together, as if intentionally made by somebody. But here's the thing, he's about 7 miles at this point away from any known trail, at least the Appalachian Trail, and these saplings were pretty thick, and for somebody to come through and actually entwine them together to make some sort of shelter-like structure, you would need tremendous strength. And so he's looking at these twisted saplings being like, my God, these are very intricately done. Somebody must have really took a lot of time to do that. And as he's sitting there observing this makeshift shelter of some kind, he begins to get this deep-seated feeling in the pit of his gut, like he's being watched or something akin to not wanting to be there, like he wasn't supposed to be there. That's the overwhelming emotion he described to me that he felt. And so he decided, you know what, I should just leave. Maybe somebody is out here squatting and I'm intruding on their territory. I'm not going to think too much of how they made the shelter, but I'll move on. And after that, he kind of circled his way around on some game trail that he had found back to his campsite, which took about another 4 or 5 hours in total. Now, he says the entire time he left that shelter, going back up a game trail up to where his camp was, he believes that he was being followed. By who or what, he's not sure because he never saw who they were or what they were. He thinks it was a couple of squatters out there, but he can't verify that. Now, he gets back to his campsite. It's about evening time, and he's been eating nothing but jerky and protein bars pretty much all day. So he's ready for a good home meal. Now, he had a couple hot dogs with him in his backpack, so not really a home meal, but it's better than beef jerky and protein bars all day. So he goes, fetches more water, starts a fire, and he's going to actually boil some hot dogs because, hey, why not, right? And so he gets the water, he starts the fire going, and he's got his pot of water boiling. He throws in his hot dogs, he's waiting for them to cook, and he decides to start picking things up in his campsite, putting things in his tent, because the next day he's actually going to move camp locations, get back on the trail, maybe go a bit further down. That's his plan. And that's right when that same sensation as before just comes over him. And during this time, he was deep in thought about eating and wanting to stuff his face and, getting his stuff ready for the next day for camping. He wasn't even thinking about the day's events that had already transpired. But this overwhelming feeling just smacked him. And he starts looking around because, again, he's like, who's watching me? Who's out here? And now he's beginning to think, did I stumble upon a grow-op? Are there squatters out here that will kill me if I come across their shelter? And so he's starting to panic. He's looking around. He doesn't see anybody. And all he has with him is a big Bowie knife. So he knows that that should suffice, but if it could be multiple people, he probably doesn't stand a chance, especially if they have weapons. And it was here again that he kind of noticed the forest had gotten a little bit quiet again. And so he's like, all right, this is weird. Something is going on. Either I'm being hunted by some psycho squatters, or there's some freaky stuff going on out here. One or the other. So he just goes back in his tent with his cooked food, by the way. He quickly pulls his pot off the fire, puts the fire out, grabs his hot dogs, and he's sitting huddled in his tent eating, gripping his Bowie knife, ready for some West Virginia back mountain folk to come and get him. But nothing ever happens. He says he stayed huddled in his tent the entire evening and night, and eventually fell asleep. Now, one of Roger's bedtime routines, as many of us have, is to go pee before you go to bed. Well, because he stayed in his tent out of fear, he didn't exactly do that before he fell asleep. So he woke up sometime early in the morning, probably about midnight or 1 or 2. He didn't exactly remember. He has to go pee really bad. So he gets up out of his tent, completely forgetting about the events that had transpired only hours before, and kind of tiredly stumbles out of his tent with his flashlight, and he goes over to a nearby tree, maybe about 20 or so feet away, and he begins to relieve himself. Now, as he's doing that, he's like, and he's looking up at the beautiful night sky, and he begins to hear a loud metallic ringing sound. And so imagine like somebody with a big beater smacking the heck out of a big sheet of metal, just bam, bam. You know how metal kind of reverberates? It's like that. And he hears that coming from above, but it sounds like the noise is everywhere. So he begins to look up and wonders to himself, what is that and where's that coming from? And he begins to see some lights in the sky moving around, which is really weird. Now, he thought it could have been a shooting star or an asteroid or a plane, but what Roger described was strange pulsating lights that were low enough in the sky that it couldn't have been a star, but were still high enough that he couldn't see all the detail. Now, he said there was a few that moved in unison right across the sky and stopped for a moment and kind of just sat there, which he thought was weird because if it was an aircraft, aircrafts don't just suddenly stop and hover. They simply just keep going. But these were already moving at a fast pace and just suddenly stopped and then just kept moving casually, as if they'd never stopped before. Now, he thought that was incredibly weird, but couldn't explain it. But remember, he's still exhausted, so in his stupor, he's like, you know what? I'm too tired for this crap. I'm going to go back to my tent and crash out, and tomorrow, I'm going back to the trail, and I'm going to go hike somewhere else. So he stumbles back in his tent, is somehow able to fall asleep through all the strangeness that is going on, wakes up the following morning, and notices a few things of his have been rifled through. At this point, he's definitely on high alert because he's like, all right, there's definitely some sort of gang of squatters out here that are trying to intimidate me or taunt me or trying to get me out of this area. So I'm going to just honor that, pack up my stuff, and go. And that's exactly what he does. Now, as he's making his way from a game trail back to the main Appalachian Trail, he notices a small boy. Now, he says small, but in actuality, the boy was probably no older than 10 or 11. Now, here's what's really strange, is that on this game trail, there was this boy just standing there, but the boy was facing away from him. Now, as he's coming up and approaching the boy from the distance, he's thinking to himself, oh my gosh, that's that kid that's been whispering and talking around my camp. I wonder if he's seriously lost or hurt. But then as he's getting closer to this kid, he notices a couple weird things off the bat. The first is that the kid is just standing perfectly still in the middle of this game trail, facing away from him, and that the kid also appears to be in strange clothes. I'm talking like circa 1950s, 60s. Very out of place for being in the middle of the woods. Now also, he noticed the kid's skin was really pale, as if the kid had never seen sunlight before. I mean, I'm talking like pastry ghost white. This kid was so white that he would scare Casper the ghost. And so as Roger's coming up to him, getting up to probably about maybe 10, 20 feet, he's going, hey kid, do you need help? Are you lost out here? And he could hear the kid start to mumble to himself. And he's thinking to himself, that's the exact same voice I had heard. It was this kid. And he's saying, hey kid, pay attention, turn around. And he goes up to the kid and he goes to grab his shoulder. And the kid reaches up, touches his hand, and slowly turns around to look at the guy. And Roger immediately notices that something is completely off. And there's two things. For one, the kid turns around, and this is when he could tell that this kid's no more than 10 or 11. But Roger immediately gets the heebie-jeebies. He says that this kid had full black eyes, like a shark, dead, soulless, just complete black eyes. And that the kid's skin was not only pale, but Roger described it as very, very plasticky looking. And that the kid's entire demeanor, attitude, the way he spoke was very stiff, rigid, robotic, awkward, out of place. And Roger's looking at this kid saying like, hey kid, are you okay? Do you need any help? Are you lost out here? What's going on? Why are you out here? Where are your parents? And so this kid, looking at Roger in the eyes, assuming so because he couldn't see any pupils, just starts laughing maniacally. Really weird and out of place, right? But Roger described it as not a gut laugh or a happy or creepy laugh. It was almost robotic. Not quite a ha 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 ha, but it was very forced and rhythmic, if that makes any sense. And after this kid laughed, he explained that his parents were deeper in the woods and points in the direction that Roger had just come from. So Roger turns around, looking back that direction, and he says, do you live out here? The kid didn't respond. Now this kid starts walking back that direction and says, come with me, I want you to meet my parents, in the most robotic, monotone voice ever. And Roger explains that he just had the creeps. He felt that whatever this kid wanted him to do was not good. His gut instinct was screaming at him to get out of there. Now, he says he's been around a lot of kids in his life, and he has never once saw the way this kid looked or been around a kid like this or ever had a feeling like in this situation. Roger quickly looked back the way he was going, which would eventually lead back to the Appalachian Trail. And when he quickly looked back at where the kid was going, the kid was now gone, just vanished, within 2 seconds gone. And again, he's kind of in a more open area, not exactly a clearing, but there's sparse trees throughout, and there's really nowhere for the kid to disappear to. And so at this point, Roger is creeped out and just, I don't know what's going on, and he just leaves. He makes his way back to the Appalachian Trail, not knowing how to explain any of this. And Roger basically concludes that in a nutshell was his weird camping trip out in the Appalachian Mountains going off trail, which is why he recommends if you're going to do that, always bring a weapon and be very alert and aware of your surroundings. Now, after him telling me this story, my first thought was that he had encountered what many call a black-eyed child, describing the skin, describing the hair, describing the eyes. And also what's interesting too is there does seem to be a correlation with Men in Black, UFOs, and black-eyed children, which is interesting because the night before when he was urinating around the tree, he looked up and saw those strange lights that when I asked him about it, he believes it could have been a UFO, but he wasn't sure. Now, as far as the dead deer with its neck twisted and the strange twisted entwined saplings, he's not exactly sure how to explain that because he reiterated to me that the saplings were entwined so thickly that it would take someone with great immense strength to do that. You'd probably need a machine, a specialized machine to do that. And this entire shelter was basically made from these twisted saplings. While it was crude, it was still very well done, and as he said, it just seemed odd and out of place because where it was easily probably more than 7 miles off the main Appalachian Trail. And this is a man who's gone backpacking all around this area, has never encountered that before, has never seen any what many people call Bigfoot, has never encountered any backwoods crazy people or cabins or anyone living back there. So he has no idea who made it, why, and really how to summarize his entire experience. But more importantly, I want to know what you guys think. Is there really strange things going on off the Appalachian Trail, or did he just make the whole thing up? I'll let you decide. Be sure to let me know what you think in the comments down below. I would love to hear from you. Also, if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and smack that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll check you guys out in the very next video.